The La Crosse Public Library Archives presents Dark La Crosse Stories, a series in collaboration with the La Crosse Tribune, featuring the seedier side of La Crosse, Wisconsin's history. These true stories are reflections of their time and place in history. The intent is not to diminish the human suffering that may have resulted from these events, but to bring light to ways in which people in the past experienced life. The city of La Crosse and the locations where these stories took place occupy part of a vast network of the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, and we thank our Ho-Chunk community members and their ancestors for their stewardship of this area's land and history.
My name is Henry Greengrass, and I've shared information in a previous Dark La Crosse Stories episode about how today's Hinoquas community, or what you call the city of La Crosse, still feels the lingering impacts of the violent invasion era. Now I will tell you another story about how far-reaching these impacts are felt. I am a Ho-Chunk citizen and a Bad River Ojibwe descendant. What this means is that I'm an enrolled citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation due to my father's side, but I'm also Ojibwe from my mother's side. I was raised in Ashland, Wisconsin, near my mother's people. What's interesting is how both sides of my family have been affected by the genocide tactic of residential boarding schools. In this episode, we will focus on the history of the St. Mary's Indian Boarding School, which many of my family members attended. This is where my grandparents met. I grew up hearing stories from my relatives about the sister school. I didn't realize that its real name was St. Mary's Indian Boarding School. It was run by the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration, who were and still are headquartered in La Crosse, Wisconsin at the St. Rose Convent. St. Mary's, however, was located 250 miles away in Odena, Wisconsin on the reservation of the Bad River Band Lake Superior Chippewa Indians. In order to understand this history, we need to look at the treaties and other federal policies that are not taught in school. Let's begin with the 1854 Treaty of La Pointe, which forced the Ojibwe to cede land in what is now northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, limiting the bands to small reservations which are still upheld today. One of the conditions in this treaty outlined that the U.S. government would be committed to pay $3,000 per year for the next 20 years for moral and educational purposes. Stipulations like this open the door to impose Western Euro-American society standards on indigenous peoples. We have been successfully educating our children since time immemorial, but in the 1800s, the American government decided how we educate our children was not to be honored. In fact, indigenous cultures, customs, religion, language, and family structures came under attack and were outlawed by the United States government policies that indigenous peoples were forced to conform with. And how did they force us? By kidnapping our children and putting them in boarding schools.
My name is Sister Eileen McKenzie, and I'm a Franciscan Sister of Perpetual Adoration. The origins of our congregation trace back to 1840s Bavaria, during a time of political unrest in Prussia and Bavaria, now Germany. 14 people, 2 priests and 12 lay people, who were all members of the Third Order Secular Franciscans, left their parish and traveled to Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1849. Their intent was to start a religious community to spread the gospel, educate children, and care for the poor among German immigrants. Immediately upon arrival in Milwaukee, women in this founding group taught German immigrant children in mission schools. Education was a founding principle for these sisters. By 1855, they opened an orphanage, and during the Civil War, they spread to elementary parochial schools. Teacher training became a high priority at this time, and Mother Antonia Erb envisioned a future with a chapel and perpetual adoration. In 1868, the La Crosse Diocese was founded, and Bishop Michael Heiss was appointed the first bishop. At this time, the La Crosse Diocese oversaw the western and northwestern sections of Wisconsin. Shortly after arriving in La Crosse in September 1868, Bishop Heiss wrote to colleagues in Europe.
On the 29th of September, the feast of the Holy Archangel Michael, I arrived to La Crosse and was received with the greatest joy. Although, because of the approaching winter, I could visit only the southern part of my diocese, I have, in the meantime, informed myself thoroughly by the correspondence with the priests stationed in the northern section, so that I may be able to give you a true report on the status of this diocese. It is about the same size as the Kingdom of Bavaria, for it embraces half of the state of Wisconsin. The Catholic population includes various nationalities: Irish, Germans, Canadians, Bohemians, Poles, Indians, and one congregation of Italians. There are few large parishes, the two largest being in La Crosse and Prairie du Chien.
Bishop Heiss needed to write back to his friends in Germany with detailed accounts like this to keep them his friends. Much of the early funding of the mission work completed by the diocese came from the people reading this letter in Europe. Bishop Heiss needed them to understand the demographics of the people living here in Wisconsin, how far he would need to travel to serve all these people, and what the challenges were facing their mission work in the area. Schools were an important factor in mission work. Children were and are the most vulnerable population to focus on for mission work. We can see in this letter that he is already dropping hints that he would like the Franciscan sisters stationed in Milwaukee to move to La Crosse to help build his vision for more schools. His letter continues.
The prospects for schools in this entire area is very bad. True, here in La Crosse, the problem is very well solved, for through the zeal of the German Catholics, a spacious building was erected 4 years ago. Outside of La Crosse, there is almost nowhere a regular Catholic school. The children attended public schools, which do not teach religion or morals. Oh, how many children of Catholic parents have on that account been lost, and still continue to go astray. One could often weep bitter tears at seeing numerous children entirely uncultured, children who would doubtless be as well behaved as others, could they but enjoy the advantages of a good education. Good and inexpensive schools in the country would be possible only with sisters managing them, but for good reasons, sisters object to going to places where they themselves could hardly hear Mass and receive the sacraments once a month. As long, therefore, as the number of priests cannot be increased, this sad condition will continue. The Indian missions along Lake Superior, belonging to this diocese, should be in good condition, for an able missionary by the name of J. Chubble of Crane is there. This good priest ministers with zeal to a parish of Catholic Chippewa Indians, numbering 3,000 souls. Since the Indians own absolutely nothing, I must at least partly support this priest. Furthermore, it is necessary for him to have an assistant, as the work is too much for him alone.
Bishop Heiss also wrote letters to the Franciscan sisters around this time, requesting they relocate to La Crosse to assist with mission and outreach efforts, which they responded to positively. A number of sisters moved to establish a mother house in La Crosse in 1871, and it was here that the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration's identity and mission was realized. The Maria Angelorum Chapel was built within 2 years of arrival, and Perpetual Adoration began in 1878. At this time, the Franciscan sisters worked closely with the Diocese of La Crosse. According to a scrapbook put together by a sister in 1979, Bishop Heiss was, quote, deeply concerned about the 1,000 Catholic Indians, end quote, that lived in northern Wisconsin. He began taking steps toward establishing a mission school, using Franciscan sisters to staff and manage the school. The author of this scrapbook wrote that the next 2 bishops, Killian Casper Flash and James Schwebach, were equally zealous for sisters to staff and run a school. In 1883, under the leadership of Mother Ludovica Keller, 3 major initiatives started. 1, the congregation officially established itself as the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. 2, the St. Francis Hospital was established in La Crosse, the sisters' first step toward health care. And 3, the St. Mary's Indian Boarding School opened in Odena, Wisconsin, on the Bad River Reservation.
It was during President Ulysses S. Grant's administration, which ran from 1869 through 1877, that the federal government began investing in the genocide tactic of residential boarding schools and mission schools as a way to eliminate indigenous peoples from existence. President Grant saw this as a more peaceful and less expensive tactic than warfare and removal, which is what the federal Indian policies sanctioned until the 1870s. Grant's shift in policy set the stage for hundreds of residential and day schools that opened between 1870 and 1890 to assimilate indigenous children. St. Mary's was just one of these. Despite their religious affiliation, church and religious orders were able to receive federal funding to finance their schools. However, policies changed in the 1890s and these schools were forced into more complicated financial situations that relied heavily on private funding. One source of funding of these schools was the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions, which was founded in 1874. This agency still exists today with the mission to advocate for the needs of Catholic Native Americans, supporting building projects, staffing schools, and enabling parish religious education programs are all core values of this group. Headquartered in Washington, D.C., the Catholic Bureau advocated for federal funding and used its political power to grow the Catholic Indian Mission Fund. In this way, the fund was in part backed by public funding, but it largely grew due to private donors. Likely the most famous of these donors was Catherine Drexel, who not only supported the fund, but also donated to individual schools. After visiting the Bad River Reservation in 1888, Catherine Drexel became a huge financier of St. Mary's. In Catholic communities, people like Catherine Drexel and Junipero Serra, who is credited for founding several Indian missions in California, have been canonized to sainthood for their mission work. But in indigenous communities, descendants of survivors consider them to be the people who funded and paved the way for genocide.
For the sisters who were called to St. Mary's, the school was a service. It was mission education work that they were dedicated to. It also became a place where sisters enforced assimilation. Pursuant to the European ideology and Catholic theology of that time, they were civilizing children and saving souls. In this way, they did not offer religious freedom to the children attending the school. Instead, they reduced Ojibwe traditional ways to paganism and imposed their own values onto the Ojibwe children attending St. Mary's. One sister, Sister Macaria, who taught at St. Mary's for over 50 years, took it upon herself to become a historian of the school. The following excerpt is from a larger piece she wrote about the history of St. Mary's, and you can hear the way she denigrates the children within her care based on her own Eurocentric expectations of behavior. You can also hear Sister Macaria's need for assimilation to control her students, as she did not take the time to understand their way of life.
The tact, zeal, and patience required to habituate these children of the forest to the discipline of school life can be better imagined than described. The children did not understand a word of English, and the sisters could neither speak nor understand the Chippewa tongue. Truly a bewildering task confronted these Makadewi Konaikwe, or black-gowned women, as the Indians styled them. For a time, the classroom was a moving caravan rather than a school. These children of the forest rebelled against the confinement of school life, but they did it in a manner truly worthy of the sagacity of their forefathers. They took advantage of the psychological moment to escape from classroom bondage. Scarcely had the recess signal sounded than they disappeared into the depths of the forest, and call as loudly and persistently as their teacher might, they failed to appear before the dawn of another day.
Hearing that quote, I think of my own family members who sat in those classrooms. For most of my life, I thought it was only my grandparents who attended the sister school. Recently, I found out while visiting the archives at St. Rose Convent that generations of my family were taken by the school. My grandparents did not really talk about their attendance, but hinted in conversations about how deplorable it was there and the lifelong impacts they had from it. When I was young, my grandma would probably show how well she could still bounce a dime on a newly fixed bed, and credited the sisters for teaching her this. I once watched her and my daughter eat potato peels out of the sink together. My grandma had learned as a child to eat the scraps when she worked in the St. Mary's kitchen because she was hungry and there wasn't much food. She even talked about how her younger sisters meant the world to her, but when they were in the sister school, they were not allowed to see each other. They would be punished by the sisters for something as simple as her younger sister sneaking over to see her. In conversations with my mom, I learned that she did not have a good relationship with her mom. After my grandma passed, my mom told me that she blames the nuns for raising my grandma to not be a good mother. It still hurts my mom on how she was raised by someone who didn't know how to show love openly, because my grandma was raised at St. Mary's, as were her parents. This is not something that can be fixed or healed or repaired. This is a legacy I carry as a descendant of boarding school survivors.
Other survivors and descendants of survivors share stories that tell us that staff in St. Mary's were known for neglect and violence. Children did not eat enough, were served food that was spoiled, were not provided appropriate clothing for harsh winters, and had to work outside in all conditions. They lived in buildings that were not heated properly. Conditions like these spread disease. In the year 1901 alone, St. Mary's had 71 cases of smallpox. In 1936, the director of the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions in Washington, D.C., noted in a letter to Sister Principal Macaria that the school had not been licensed by the state of Wisconsin, quote, because of the condition of the building that was being used as a dormitory. For the next 30 years, the school struggled for funding. The buildings were in disrepair, and the sisters worked hard to keep St. Mary's running.
By the 1950s, the federal government realized that boarding schools were losing their effectiveness. People were leaving reservations because there were few job opportunities and poor living conditions. The government shifted its Indian policies with a goal to terminate tribal governments and assimilate indigenous peoples completely. The Bureau of Indian Affairs used propaganda to encourage Native Americans to leave their homes and reservations and move to large cities with the prospects of housing, employment, and a better life using a pilot program that would later become the Indian Relocation Act. My grandparents left the Bad River Reservation for a better life and as a way to escape the sisters for the safety of their children. As the population at the reservation declined, the St. Mary's boarding school was forced to close in 1969.
FSPA sisters at St. Mary's moved to teaching at the nearby Catholic school in Ashland, run by the Superior Diocese. The Bad River children were given the choice of attending public school or the Catholic school. The children who attended the Catholic school received the same abuse as the children at St. Mary's. In 2020, the La Crosse County Historical Society published a piece in their newsletter about the St. Mary's boarding school. Learning this history moved me and other sisters to look again at our relationship with the descendants of Bad River. We started to hear stories from survivors of the school, their children and their grandchildren, and recognized there was a call to return to the mission of St. Mary's, to listen and believe these painful stories. There was a call to search for the truth with the descendants who share their experiences of intergenerational trauma and courageous stories of resilience and strength. Now the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration have established a mission of truth and healing to address the congregation's historical complicity in unjust and genocidal systems. In this mission, we are committed to research and education of our sisters and partners in mission about our history and impact of St. Mary's and the boarding school era. While we've searched our archives to learn the stories that we've told ourselves over the years, we've also, and perhaps most importantly, heard the stories of survivors and descendants and worked with them to share our expanded understanding of this time in our shared history. One example of this effort is this Dark Lacrosse episode. We're cultivating relationships with Indigenous peoples with whom we share a history and/or occupy ancestral lands. For example, our sisters work with the La Crosse Indigenous community, which includes Bad River tribal members and descendants. We partner with programs located in the Ho-Chunk Nation Three Rivers House. One of our sisters works full-time in Odena, and we are researching ways of creating access to lands that the congregation currently owns and from which Indigenous communities were forcibly displaced. We support, advocate, and promote political efforts of healing and reparation. We are working with the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, have opened our archives to survivors and descendants of survivors of St. Mary's, and advocate for Secretary Deb Haaland's Federal Indian Boarding School Commission. We stand with the Bad River Band in their efforts to protect the water and land against Line 5. We've promoted expanding the Ho-Chunk Powwow in La Crosse, helped increase awareness of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and support the creation of a Ho-Chunk garden in the La Crosse International Friendship Gardens. We've done other things too. This is all just a start in the healing process of what we hope becomes one of reparation for the trauma experienced by so many at St. Mary's. As one member of the Bad River Band once told me, the relationship we had for 100 years did a lot to us. It might take more than that to heal.
Now, I'd like to introduce Tracy Littlejohn, my friend and researcher of Native American boarding schools.
Some Indigenous scholars and activists argue that residential boarding schools were the most damaging thing to happen to Indigenous and First Nation peoples in the U.S. and Canada. When we talk about this history, we need to address it for what it was: genocide. Genocide inflicted on children. Children who were forced to grow up and to raise their own children with what they had learned themselves. Children who had no access to resources to heal or learn what happened to them. We need to change this. The United Nations defines genocide as committing any of the following acts with intent to destroy the group. A. Killing members of the group. B. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. C. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. D. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. E. Forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. We know from looking at the history of residential schools that it was the intent of the U.S. government to destroy Indigenous peoples by using this last tactic, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Let me tell you about that history now. In 1794, the United States government began to write treaties with Indigenous tribes, who were often forced to agree to treaty terms under unethical or violent circumstances. The U.S. underpaid for land acreage and the vast resources that came with it. In these treaties, the government agreed to fund educational services for children. Over the next 110 years, the government wrote 709 land cession treaties and funded the forced removal of Indigenous peoples to reservations. It is hard to quantify how many forced removals occurred, but there are 326 reservations in the U.S., and each reservation has a history of ceded territory and forced removal to that reservation. And along the way, there were a number of violent wars and battles as many Indigenous groups defended their homelands and people from colonizing forces. The removal period was a violent time in Indigenous history, and it's impossible to know how many Native people died at the hands of the U.S. government and white colonizers. But after the Civil War, the federal government began a slow shift in policy. Likely, politicians and officials realized how expensive it was to fund ongoing military efforts against Native Americans. Some officials argued that removal and extermination of Indigenous peoples was unethical and unchristian, so they needed a new approach. Whites divided into two parties. One side were exterminationists, who believed in ethnic cleansing and felt that Indigenous peoples should be removed to distant reservations with little contact with white society. The other side were assimilationists, who believed that the U.S. government should fund the education of Indigenous peoples and then integrate them into American society. While at the time, the assimilationists were considered the peaceful option, today we can look at what they argued with a new lens. They argued for genocide while labeling it as a humanitarian effort for peace. The assimilationists wanted to teach Indigenous peoples English and Christianity, but also other Western principles, like farming and democracy. There was no acknowledgement that Indigenous peoples farmed these lands for thousands of years before forced colonization of the Americas, or that democracy is actually based on principles that America's founding fathers learned from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is considered the world's oldest representative democracy. The assimilationists whitewashed history and wanted to whitewash Indigenous peoples in the same way. President Ulysses S. Grant's administration began in 1869, and he strongly supported assimilation. In his first inaugural address, he proclaimed,
I bring to this office a conscious desire and determination to fill it to the best of my ability to the satisfaction of the people. The country having just emerged from a great rebellion, many questions will come before it for settlement in the next 4 years, which preceding administrations have never had to deal with. In meeting these, it is desirable that they should be approached calmly, without prejudice, hate, or sectional pride, remembering that the greatest good to the greatest number is the object to be attained. The proper treatment of the original occupants of the land, the Indian, is one deserving of careful study. I will favor any course towards them which tends to their civilization, Christianization, and ultimate citizenship.
The Grant administration promised public funding for assimilation efforts, but there was no plan in place yet. Lieutenant Richard Henry Pratt changed that. Pratt had participated in exterminationist practices early in his career while managing prison war camps with Native American inmates. He envisioned a future of assimilation. In these camps, Pratt established a series of practices which included forcing the inmates to wear military uniforms, assigning them anglicized names, cutting their hair, disciplining any use of their languages, enforcing Euro-American hard labor ethics, and practicing Christianity. Pratt used this experience and framed it as successful field research. He argued that if he were able to open a school for children, assimilation of indigenous peoples would become more efficient because children are not born savage, but taught to be savage. He secured funding to open the first Native American boarding school in Pennsylvania called the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. In this school, he used the same principles as the prison war camp. Children wore uniforms, were assigned anglicized names, their hair was cut, and they were not allowed to use their language or have contact with their family. They were taught some basic education like math and English, but at least half of their days were spent learning labor skills. Girls were taught domestic servant skills, and boys were taught farming, construction, and machinery. Carlisle was considered a great success. Propaganda showed images of indigenous children when they entered the school, and images of them 3 years later, and this spread across the country. In 1892, Pratt delivered a speech at the National Conference of Charities and Correction, where he said the following famous words.
A great general once said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him, and save the man.
The Carlisle Indian School was the first of at least 408 boarding schools in the U.S. and 140 more in Canada. Some schools were run by the government, while others were mission schools run by churches. In Wisconsin, there were at least 12 boarding schools. St. Mary's in Odena opened only 4 years after Carlisle in 1883 and used many of the same assimilation practices. The sisters assigned Christian names to the children, forbade them to speak Ojibwe or practice their spirituality. Some people remember the Franciscan Sisters' St. Mary's boarding school as a safer or gentler boarding school compared to others. But as we listen to the survivors and descendants of St. Mary's, we hear stories of violence. Ultimately, there is no gentle way to strip people, especially children, of their culture, their language, their spirituality, their family structures, their names, their food traditions, their identity. To strip children of their culture is to destroy the group. It is in this way that the U.S. government, the Canadian government, and any other organization that ran a boarding school, including the FSPA, was complicit in genocide. To minimize the boarding schools as nothing less than genocide is to minimize their impact and the atrocities that happen within all boarding schools, including St. Mary's.